This video is brought to you by the Nicholas County Historical and Genealogical Society. This month's presentation is Digging Up Your Ancestors, a genealogical primer by local author and historian Rock Foster. Held at the Southern Baptist Fellowship Hall, 201 Irish Street, Summersville, West Virginia. November 10, 2024.
I'd like to do this hopefully by trying to share some of the research that I did on my ancestors. Hopefully can provide you some information sources, maybe a few helpful hints. There won't be any specific genealogical topics addressed in any real detail. I'm just going to kind of skim the surfaces. I did use the information that I collected, was instrumental in my writing of the 3 books that I've written after I started the genealogical research. I said, you know, this is just, the stories are too rich not to share with the public. And I like what Thomas Paine says. He says, what we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. And it's the dearness only that gives everything its value. And I'm a big proponent of that. And my problems are, oh, this is awesome. Forgive me, I've got to take a break. This is supposed to transfer automatically, and it's not. It's rather bulky. You have 128 volumes, such as this one, and they're just huge books. I would highly recommend the Guild Press version, and you can probably pick it up for $50 or $60. And it's just a CD-ROM, and it's also searchable, which makes it just indispensable for Civil War research. I think there were like 13 mentions of the Hughes Ferry in the official records. Just an example of what their information looks like. It just so happens that this was a report from General Rosecrans, the Union General, to General Cox about one of the officers' reports, and he said, his report made me think a report we started yesterday worked well. It stated that we intended to cross Hughes Ferry if Golly ran blood. I wonder where I've heard that before.
Wonder where you got the
I don't know. Gee, just moving along here. Shameless plugging of my book, but that's all right. There's numerous ones, and I obviously am going to elaborate a little bit more about the Civil War resources because, and as Joe was saying, we have a lot of Civil War that took place here, and communities really can take advantage of that if you promote it in the right way. But you can do this through the National Archives. I know that I got Chris's military records, and they were rather limited, But you can see in this particular record he had debilitus and diarrhea, which is not exactly probably the best thing that you can have as a soldier. But then you also have regimental histories. This particular one is of the 22nd Virginia by Terry Lowry. Terry's done a lot of, he's written probably 6 or 8 different books, but this just happens to be on the 22nd, which was C.C. Hughes's regiment. And it was kind of interesting to note that it did happen to mention that he had deserted back following the Battle of Lewisburg. Well, he didn't exactly desert. It's just that the Confederate troops were decimated. I mean, they were just, I mean, many were killed, and they just ran off. They had no place to go. And he only lived a few miles away, so where would you go if you didn't have a home to go to? You would go home, right? And he appeared again, obviously finished out the war. But it was just, you have to be able to season the information that you collect. You can't take everything for face value, because if someone just read that, they'd say, "Oh, he was a deserter." No, he wasn't. He just needed to regroup. That's all. It's kind of interesting also the way that information that you collect will reinforce other information. In this particular case, you find out that the 22nd Virginia, this was right before 3rd Winchester, and the 22nd Virginia was fed rancid beef, okay? And they talked here about how they would, when they would cook it, they would put it on their bayonet, they would hold it in the fire, and it would pop and crack. And what was popping and cracking was maggots exploding in the meat, but that's all they had to eat. So, you do what you have to do. Well, you find out 3 days later that Chris is in the hospital with debilitus and diarrhea. Again, I wonder, what's that all about? But it's just sometimes interesting the way that they complement one another. And my notes are not showing up, which leaves me out there kind of winging it, but that's all right. We covered the regimental histories. Oh, there's a sundry of different books. I have some examples back here. September Blood, Terry Lowry, about the Battle of Carnifax Ferry. Indispensable as far as I was concerned. He also covers the skirmish at Hughes Ferry in this book. There are different letters and diaries out there that are accessible through, many are private sources, but you can also get them from historical societies and in published book. This one happens to be from an officer that he owned Golly Mount, which is where the old Hawks Nest Golf Course used to be, and this was his notes in a letter back to his wife about the Battle of Carnifax Ferry. You have compiled military rosters. Ones that I am familiar with in particular are Tim McKinney's. He did an inventory from the 1890 census about the Confederate soldiers and the Union soldiers in West Virginia. They're voluminous books, but wow, any soldier that ever served in West Virginia is in there, generally with his regiment and his rank. Okay.
You're rebooting again, Rocky?
Not quite,
Okay.
I hope. I apologize,
Well, that's interesting. The other request I've had a gentleman from up in the Midwest call me. His name is Gross, Grose, and he's looking for information on his great-grandfather, who was George Richmond Gross from out on Panther Mountain. He was born in 1869 here. So he's trying to write the book. He's 92 years old, so he's asking me to feed him data. So I've been to the courthouse and other places. And you ask, well, why you want to know about George Richmond Gross? Well, it turns out that his grandfather, great-grandfather, whatever, went on to be a very prominent minister in the Methodist Church, ended up having a big bunch up in Massachusetts, and ended up being the president of DePaul University out in the Midwest, and also went to China as a missionary way back there. So he was trying to run down the history.
we're able to go in and do a little metal detecting, and of course you had in the time of the Civil War, this is the way you would find your ammunition. It would be in generally I think it was a pack of 10 bullets, and they would provide you the bullet and the wadding and the powder, and then you would have to distribute those in the gun accordingly. They would have one bullet, they would have what was known as a Williams cleaner bullet in each packet, and the Williams cleaner bullet was a shorter, stubbier bullet, but it had a zinc plate, a round zinc plate on the tail end of it. And because the black powder was so dirty in the barrels, that this zinc, you would fire this Williams cleaner, and that zinc plate would literally scrape the black powder out of the barrel. And I'm told that normally you could only fire your rifle about 80 times, and at that point you couldn't get a bullet in it to fire it. So anyway, just and of course you have the infamous mini ball that was used notoriously during the Civil War, and we found mini balls. We also found a lot of musket balls. The 4 on the outside here are musket balls. The one in the middle is a representative mini ball named after a Frenchman by the name of Captain Claude Monet. But we actually found these most likely fired by Union soldiers on September the 10th of 1861. They were firing across the cliffs, or across the river at the cliffs, at Confederate pickets that were firing upon them from the other side of the river. In addition to Civil War resources, there are any number of internet sources out there. This is Ancestry.com. It's normally about, I think it's around $20 a month or $200 a year. And it seems a little pricey, but when you think that if you make a trip to Virginia somewhere to go to a courthouse, well, you're going to have probably $30, $40 worth of gasoline. You'll have lunch. You might have a night's stay in a hotel. All of a sudden, $200 is really cheap. Another source is family Bibles. Many family Bibles, they'll contain obviously children, birth and death dates, and sundry of other information. This just happens to be Isaac Foster's Bible. You can see it's a little aged. Supposedly has a dove skin cover on it. And this is the King Charles edition. And somewhat interesting, if you can note right here, the page has been torn across here. And if you notice, they sewed it back together with needle with needle and thread. I guess they didn't have tape to use, but you can see the little stitches across through there, which just makes it a very precious thing. Here you see that William Hughes and Mary Foster were married in April of 1777. So it just gives you an idea of what to expect in a family Bible. And certainly, last but not least, libraries have a myriad of family histories and different types of resource books that you can use. Another that is indispensable, unfortunately, Nicholas County has a really good cemetery book. Thank you, Mary, very much. Of course, your tombstones will frequently have birth dates and death dates, and even sometimes when they're buried, people are buried together or nearby. You find out, though, hey, that guy just happens to be a relation that I had never heard of. And then, of course, again, as I say, as we're digging up our ancestors, you find out that obituaries and newspapers are also indispensable. As we studied about Chris Hughes, we also learned about another man by the name of Ned Hughes, and he kept popping up in histories and journals, and he and his brother, this photo taken about 1965, they operated a ferry boat, and you see that little goober moving back and forth there. I believe it was in that particular eddy of the river. And in the upper left-hand corner there, that's actually where Chris's house was. Chris Hughes's house was located. The ferry was run by Ned Hughes. I'm getting my stories right. And of course, that's the Summersville. It's the Summersville Lake today. The ferry operated here on the approximate location there on the gully. You can see the 1952 concrete bridge, and this is before the new bridges were built across. And that would, his story would encompass my second book on the banks of Golly. And Ned Hughes, he arrived in the Kanawha Valley about 1775, and his father operated a block house on a stream named after him, Hughes Creek, in the community of Houston. I think it's before you get to Glass Cove as you're going down the Kanawha River. But anyway, Ned lived there with his dad and his uncle in the block house, and they did a lot of trapping and fishing on the Kanawha. Well, anyway, he was taken captive when he was about 14 or 15 years old, taken into the Ohio country. His trapping and fishing skills would undoubtedly have been very valuable to the Indians, so they kept Ned alive, I think, for that reason. He spent a couple of years with them and would eventually escape. He returned home to Hughes Creek. He fell in love with a young lady. He married and he moved to what would become Nicholas County. The painting here is by Andrew Canez, a friend of mine, and he actually did, I engaged him to do the cover for my book. I wanted to try to shoot for that period look. That I thought that he did a very nice job. Ned's story was he and his brother had a little 400-acre tract there, what we know today as Hughes Bridge. And anyway, one day he was approached by a senator and some other men, and they said, "We're sorry, Mr. Hughes, but this land belongs to us." And he was dumbfounded. He had been He'd had it surveyed, he'd been paying taxes on it, he had built cabins, fences, he had fields, he was growing crops there. And anyway, the senator went on to say, well, you know, we have this 43,000 acre tract to the south of you. And his story was they had surveyed the southern boundary of this 43,000 acre tract. And when they got to this point, it started raining, and the river here got high, and they couldn't get it across. So they did what they called a protracted closure. And they just literally drew a straight line from that point to this point, probably near Canvas, somewhere in the vicinity of Anstead. But that line was almost 16 miles long. And because it inscribed Ned's property, they claimed it. And this would, Ned was actually evicted without being allowed to appear in court. And they had so many squatters in that day that this was it was a standard legal procedure that they would use. And he was actually evicted in a fictitious name, which was also allowed. Well, after 6 years of research on Ned, we just assumed that we had every bit of information that you could ever have on him, and we were wrong. We just happened, there was one courthouse that we had not, for whatever reason, made it to, and that was the Greenbrier County Courthouse. And lo and behold, in their fiduciary records, we were able to find 140 documents about the lawsuit that transpired around Ned trying to gain back his property from the senator and the other men. And they allowed us to go in and scan them. And then my wife and I took them home and spent the next year, I repeat, year, transcribing them, because this was a deed, this was Ned's deed to the property and part of a survey. This was where Ned actually wrote his own proceedings when he appealed his case to the Greenbrier County Court, and that's before it was appealed by one of the litigants to the Virginia State Appeals Court. And as you can see, you have 140 documents. This is very typical. But if you blow that up a little bit, you can see, and this is actually very good writing here. Some of them are they're just impossible. But that's things that you're going to run into when you start looking at old documents about your family. And just as our study into Chris Hughes led into Ned, and another one led us to a man by the name of James Sims. And he just happened to be my 5th great-grandfather. James Sims just happened to own 19 slaves back in the day when that was popular. And one of them, a certain Isaac Sims, he was manumitted by James Sims in around the year 1836. Now, he was manumitted. He was sold his freedom for basically just a penance, because I think that he and James had grown to be more like father and son than father and slave. And of course, there's also the possibility that he maybe was a son, for all I know. I'll not speculate on that currently. But this was Isaac Sims' manumission letter. And this, if you go in the Nicholas County Courthouse, and the door, right where you go in, the county clerk's office on the right, is where this is a framed document, and it's right there on the outside in the hallway. And Isaac Sims, he was well known by a lot of people. I think well liked. He was allowed a lot of freedoms as a slave. He was married, but in the state of, or in the Commonwealth of Virginia in that day, if you were a free person of color, you weren't allowed to live here. You had to leave. Well, Isaac was married to another slave on another farm who was owned by someone else, They actually had 2 children together. He likely would visit his family Saturday after work, and then have his family life with his wife and kids, and then he would have to be back to his plantation Monday morning before work. So he's in a real pickle. If he leaves, he has to abandon his family. If he stays, he likely has to go back into slavery. Anyway, lo and behold, found out that 130, I repeat, 130 people in the area, men in the area, signed a petition to the Virginia legislature requesting that he be made a permanent resident of the Commonwealth. And I mean, when do you ever hear of somebody doing something nice like that for a slave, let alone 130 people? And I'll have you know that I had 5 grandfathers that signed that document, and I am most proud of that. Just in passing, there was another little slave girl, a little 6-year-old girl, that James Sims actually sold to the same people that had acquired her parents. And her name was July Helen. And you say, July Helen, interesting name. Well, the crux of that is Helen was her mother's name. She was born in July, so a lot of times they would just name the children in the month of the year. Ergo, she was July Helen. I mean, you've heard of June, you've heard of May, you've heard of all these names, and many of them were propagated like that. So there's our list, be it good or bad. I'm sure that there's many other things that you can find sources in places that you might never expect it. But this was our experience, and yes, it was exciting. And let me encourage you to dig up your ancestors. You might discover a little something about yourself at the same time. And you've heard me say that my relatives were no one of any real consequence. They were just the backbone of the country. And I mean that most sincerely, because they were literally the children of the wilderness. And we began with a tombstone, and we'll end with one. And I certainly do wish you joy as you dig up your ancestors.
Thank you, Robbie.